Okay, we are live. So I want to welcome you to the educational session, the third of what we planned, five planned. This one is going to focus on energy systems and grid policy. We have joining us Lisa from South Face and Matt from Green Links, and they're going to walk us through this. Remember to mute your mics, turn off your video if you need to, and we'll have questions at the end. So without any further from me, take it away, Lisa and Matt.
Thanks very much, Mike, and hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Bianchi-Fossati, and I'm the Policy and Sustainability Services Director at South Face. With me is Matt Cox from GreenLink Analytics, President and CEO, and he and I are going to be walking you through this discussion today. We do want to make it a discussion, so we want to thank you in advance for your time and participation. We want to invite questions in the chat or raised hands throughout, or perhaps interjections if something really resonates with you. And rest assured that we'll be endeavoring to reserve a good bit of time at the end for further discussion and Q&A. So if anyone cannot see the slides right now, please flag that in the chat and we'll do some troubleshooting, help you do some troubleshooting. Otherwise, we're going to get rolling. We want to let you know that we appreciate you, the Citizens Advisory Board, for creating this opportunity for us to speak to you about energy systems and grid policy today, and for allowing us to bring this content and this discussion to the broader community.
Hey, Lisa.
Yes.
This is Andrew Saunders. I don't know if it's just me, but I'm seeing extensive gray areas on the presentation, including your top right corner. And that tends to be when you have other things open in the background or on top of them. So you may want to drag some of your window tabs out of the way of the presentation.
Huh. I don't really. Let me do a little bit of...
Yeah, I see the same thing too.
Do you really? Okay. Thank you, guys. Let me see. It is front and center. Is that any better?
Slightly, but
well, it mostly went away. At least the big gray box went away.
Yeah.
How's that?
There you go.
That is ideal.
All right. Okay. So starting again then. Thank you for flagging that, Andrew. I appreciate it. So we'll kick off with some materials that are familiar to all of you that we wanted to recap just to ground today's discussion in clean energy. So we know that energy is essential. We know that we've got natural gas in play for heating and cooking. We've got electricity, and we've got petroleum products and gasoline for driving our cars. In addition, we know that electricity is just one type of energy. So the electricity that we use is produced from other sources: fossil fuels, solar, wind, hydroelectricity, and otherwise. We currently deliver that electricity through a centralized power system. Centralized power plants use different fuel types to generate electricity. It's then transmitted over long distances through our transmission networks and distributed to our end users through local distribution circuits or the distribution network. So this is a vertically integrated model. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment here, but generation, transmission, distribution, end use. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Athens power mix, where currently, under business as usual, Athens currently uses coal, nuclear, natural gas, PV, and hydro in this combination as of 2018. Under a business as usual scenario, those fuel types will remain in play and move accordingly between now and 2035, as this bar graph to the right shows. These were numbers that were run by GreenLink. And I want to emphasize the idea of a business as usual scenario. If the city county did not have a 100% goal and was not attempting to undertake the transition that we are talking about and we're working on together, this is what the fuel mix is projected to look like for the city county between now and 2035. But we are here, the community is here to change that. Current sources of energy, as we know, have an impact. They create jobs, but they also create environmental and human health impacts. So really the key here is that nothing is perfect, but what we are striving to do in the transition to clean energy is to minimize the adverse impacts and maximize the benefits. Clean energy sources of energy, as we know, include energy efficiency first. So the opportunity to reduce that which we consume and to clean up that which is needed, that which we do have to consume. Clean energy creates a variety of jobs. We've demonstrated here some of the efficiency jobs and some of the solar jobs. One point of note that many of you may know is that rooftop solar installations or distributed energy resources create infinitely more jobs or significant orders of magnitude more employment opportunities than large utility scale solar installations. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go as well. Clean energy also is better for the environment and human health. It uses less water, it creates less air pollution and particulate matter, and there are a variety of other co-benefits of clean energy and the transition away from fossil fuels. So why clean energy? This graphic at the left is hopefully very familiar to you all. It is on your website. There's a real economic impact of our energy decisions, not only in the job creation element that we just alluded to, but also in terms of real dollars moving in and out of the state and moving in and out of the city, county, and out of households and businesses. So $22.9 billion a year flows out of Georgia for our current fuel purchases. That's petroleum, natural gas, and coal. And the annual government budget is just a touch higher at $27.5 billion. So when you think about that, it's pretty incredible that we're not retaining more of those monetary resources in the state for energy uses and other uses. On the right-hand side, we wanted to illustrate or show where the money flows with regard to Athens-Clarke County. So nearly 500 million leaves Athens each year, and that is expected to grow over time as well. And so these numbers, again, were run by GreenLink Analytics, looking at the cash flows and the dollars that are leaving Athens for energy right now, or I shouldn't say now, we are in 2020, but dollars leaving Athens in 2018, and real dollars leaving Athens or projected to leave Athens in 2035. So our clean energy transition can also have a positive impact on the amount of money that stays in the city, county, and in the community for other purposes. Next up, wanted to share a few thoughts about the fact that it's not just Athens-Clarke County and other municipalities around the country and around the state who are adopting 100% commitments that have clean energy in mind. Energy service providers and investors recognize that they also need to undertake this transition and to transform. They know that. Wanted to highlight some key companies here who have made some very compelling statements in that regard. Southern Company, the holding company for the utilities that supply a number of southeastern states, Georgia amongst them. So in this case, Georgia Power Company is one of the Southern Company family of companies. Others you might be familiar with include Alabama Power, Mississippi Power. In 2018, they set a goal for a 50% reduction of GHG emissions and are moving towards a low to no carbon future. Now, again, I emphasize that they're a holding company and they have a family of companies underneath them. The speed at which those family of companies, Georgia Power amongst them, also move towards this goal is a challenge. And it's a big group of players that need to come together to make this happen. Similarly, BP and Shell, oil super majors that work at the multinational level, have made some really compelling statements and commitments over time. And they are recognizing that they are no longer just an oil and gas company. They are energy companies. They're making some strategic changes in the way that they do business, and they're making some really interesting strategic investments. One that I would highlight is Shell acquired a company called Sonnen, or Sonnen Battery, based in Germany. When you think about Shell Energy, a company that you might normally think of as a petroleum company that delivers gasoline for your car, acquiring a battery storage player, that's pretty telling and pretty interesting. They're also a majority shareholder now in Silicon Ranch, a solar developer nationwide. So you can see them not only making these statements, but making material moves to transform their businesses. Also draw your attention really quickly to BlackRock. Some of you may have seen that announcement earlier this year. They are a major venture capital firm, and they have begun to actively withhold or withdraw investment from companies that do not take climate change seriously. And so they are actively looking to pivot their investments and their investment recommendations towards energy efficiency and renewables. And they have a lot of money that's under their influence and a lot of CEOs that they work with. So that's a pretty significant move by them. I share this to say that it's widely acknowledged, and we're at a bit of an inflection point where a variety of players acknowledge and understand that the transition to clean energy is necessary and imperative for a variety of reasons. So some of the challenges and opportunities that we'll be looking at together on the road ahead are also in the frame and in the view and in the eyesight of others. So don't feel alone in this journey by any means. Next up, and finally, why clean energy? For all of these community-oriented reasons and non-energy benefits illustrated here. We know that climate change is upon us and that there are climate change impacts for Athens-Clarke County, for the residents and businesses in the city county.
You're muted again.
Muted.
Very strange. Okay, I got muted there somehow. Apologies for that. So these impacts we all know about, and we know about them very well from personal experience and from prior conversations we've had. So again, I just wanted to ground us in some of this background and this context. I know that we've discussed it before, but now we'll move into a little bit more of the deeper dive conversation about the history of the energy system and electricity in Georgia and some other elements that we think you'll find interesting. I'll turn it over to hear from Matt.
So speaking of grounding in context, let's have a whole lot of history. Give you background of how we got here. So just in the start of the electricity industry, you had a lot of different competing companies and there wasn't a uniform approach. Some of you might remember the battles between like Tesla and Edison over just whether you were going to have direct current or alternating current and what was going to make the most sense going forward as a plan, which obviously Tesla ended up winning that particular fight, and we have this AC network as a result. But there were not the series of standards produced yet, and as a result, it made it very hard to actually kind of grow the industry and to start to provide electricity for all the services that it might be able to deliver upon. So interestingly, you started to have some of the bigger players in the industry ask for regulation. So noted here, Samuel Insull, who was with Chicago Edison, a big player for that city at that time, pushes for regulation. And so then they start to create some of these associations. If we go to the next slide. So this is a little bit more of the history in Atlanta proper, or in Georgia really. But you start with some of our initial utilities getting underway here. And then Lisa found this wonderful picture that of just giving you an idea of like what it would have been like in the late 1800s, early 1900s of trying to get electric service out in Georgia. That, you know, it's a good reminder, you didn't have cars yet. You know, there wasn't a cherry picker truck or one of these line trucks to go out in. You had this kind of a design. So overall, we start to see this development, and the Georgia Public Service Commission, who regulates all kinds of utilities in Georgia, so not just electric power, but many utilities, comes into existence in the in the early 1900s. We get, yep. So the setup for a lot of this was to create regulated monopolies. And there was, these are some characteristics of those. You'll see this is broader application than simply just the electric utility industry. But there are a number of characteristics. And you're looking, in general, these are things that you might say create natural monopolies, would be the context and the term used from economics, where you have the market itself is going to tend towards aggregation and merger and acquisition until you have one major player. And in those situations, regulation may make sense as a way to try to make sure that there's not too much market power and that you have fair prices for these services to the rest of the public. So we've listed on the slide a few of the characteristics that you see in those areas. But utilities are a classic example. So there's not a single, you do have a single firm or a single seller. That's monopoly by definition. It's difficult to substitute away. The regulation component is actually going to help create barriers to entry for many market players. And you have the ability to set prices. And that becomes also a function of the regulation. So to go to the electric utility example in particular, you see a host of reasons for this. One is just you have electricity delivery, which is essentially like the most just-in-time thing ever. I mean, stuff's going to move at the speed of light, and it needs to meet demand instantaneously in order to make sure that that the lights literally stay on. So you have this network that's created to make sure that energy can get from the generation source through that network to the end load. If you have, so the theory was just instead of building a whole lot of little generators, you could probably do this better to build a large one that would then be able to manage an awful lot of this load. That's going to require major investments, which is going to require deep pockets, and you start to get bigger and bigger entities as a part of this. Economies of scale are also going to be something that, again, because we're building bigger and bigger, you're going to want to try to take advantage of. And the thought is that costs are going to decrease as your output increases. The major harms for a lot of this is going to come through a lack of competition. So you don't have firms that are competing to serve that local demand, whatever that demand is, however big that demand is. You have one player who has been granted the right to serve all of those customers. And so as a result, you are reliant on regulation. And that can come from any number of places, but the most direct place is coming out of the Public Service Commission or the Public Utilities Commissions at the state level. You also have actors like state legislators that are going to that can help set this, and we'll get into what some more of those details look like. And then the last slide for me on this stretch is to take a look at how this was built. So in the early 1900s, once we had standardization, most of the major cities had some sort of utility that was providing power to them. A lot of rural America, though, was not getting electric service. And so one of the major things to come out of FDR's administration during the Great Depression was this effort to do rural electrification and the establishment of a handful of large federally owned utilities like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Those effectively grew the industry to a point where most people in the country had access to electricity. And most of it was regulated through this natural monopoly model. As we moved towards the end of the 20th century, we started to see much more pressure to actually introduce competitive markets into the electricity industry. And so this started to become an idea in the 80s with a lot of kind of academic, economic papers being published. And we saw major changes happen across the country during the 1990s, where a lot of states passed legislation to create markets. And so what you wanted to do there was to say, how about we don't have this vertically integrated model where you go from generation to the wire to the customer and billing all within one company, but we split this up. And so the generators are going to compete in order to get access to sell their power. And we're going to have another series of companies that are going to be responsible for delivering that power to the end customer and issuing the final bill. That could allow for many more people and companies to compete on both sides there. The intent was also then we need to lower barriers to entry. And there may be an opportunity to get new investments into the industry, which had been very stable and consistent for decades, but also maybe not the most interesting thing in the world from the perspective of many investors.
Thanks, Matt. Last one.
Okay, sorry. In Georgia, we've also had a series of explorations here. So, and it's important to remember when we're talking about, our energy supply, there's also the gas component here. Deregulation was studied for both. So it ended up happening for natural gas. So in 1997, the legislature passes the Natural Gas Competition and Deregulation Act. In the following year, that marketplace opened. So we've had, this is the reason that you get so many notifications about potential people and companies wanting to sell you natural gas, and why you can go onto the Public Service Commission's website and compare the prices of, a handful, about 10 or so companies that are trying to compete for your business on the natural gas side. On the electricity side, there were public hearings around this, and there was a final report issued by the Public Service Commission, but we ended up not going forward with deregulation on the electric utility side of things. And part of the context around that was that the markets struggled early in their development, and there was some exploitation there, which are exemplified by the California electricity crisis in 2000 and Enron in 2001, who was claiming to have energy that they did not have and could not deliver, which obviously becomes a problem. So there's been many reforms made in those deregulated marketplaces to try to address some of these learnings, but it was not anything that Georgia itself ever went through since we retained the regulated monopoly model.
So thanks for that history lesson, Matt. And I'll reiterate as we look ahead at today, which is where we're going next in the conversation, that those Enron and California experiences did disrupt Georgia's thinking and progress on deregulating or restructuring the energy markets here in a big way. So much so that today, Matt and I experience in some of the advocacy conversations we have with elected officials and decision makers, comments from them saying, this is exactly why California has rolling blackouts and we don't. So the utility industry has a long institutional memory, and when they see peers and others impacted by certain decisions and impacted in adverse ways, they do remember that, and it makes them, less comfortable undertaking significant transformation. So we'll talk today about where we are with the electric system today. We've had that history lesson, and now we want to bring it forward and bring the conversation forward into today's electricity system, today's energy systems, and talk a little bit more about that at light touch at a federal and a national level, but more specifically with regard to Georgia, and then drilling down a bit into Athens-Clarke County. So the traditional model for electric system services is here in this diagram. It's depicted vertically because, again, that traditional model is a vertically integrated model where all components of the electric system value chain are owned and operated by one entity. So that's the generation side, the resource planning side, transmission, coordination, distribution, and retail sales. An example of a vertically integrated utility that owns and operates all of these elements here in Georgia is Georgia Power, but there are other large vertically integrated investor-owned utilities elsewhere in the country as well. Some of our municipal utilities as well operate like mini investor-owned utilities and do have ownership control over generation, transmission, distribution, and retail sales as well. So it's not only our investor owns, but this is a model that is most familiar to that business type. Oops, sorry about that. So then we're going to talk a little bit about regulated electricity markets, which is where this vertically integrated structure thrives and where it's found. In a regulated market, these vertically integrated utilities do hold that whole value chain that we just spoke about, but they have regulatory oversight. And some people call this the regulatory compact. In order to have the privilege and the opportunity of monopoly service, as Matt described, and of that vertical ownership, they trade off by acquiescing or acceding to regulatory oversight. Utility needs to do their job to make sure that the power is generated and delivered reliably, consistently, safely. And they, in turn, subject themselves again to regulatory oversight. Part of that, however, results in this monopoly construct, or is part of this monopoly construct, and also results in monopoly service. And what we mean when we say that is something we'll talk about a little bit further on here called the Territorial Service Act, which is something explicit to Georgia, but there are similar constructs in place in other regulated markets. What that basically means is that you will be served by the electricity provider that serves your location. When you open a business in that location or move to that location, you don't have electric choice. And for many of you, you're familiar with the choice you have in natural gas, the postcards that you receive, the variety of gas providers that you can choose from. Unlike a restructured market like natural gas, as Matt spoke about, electricity is not restructured, and therefore you have no electric choice or no provider choice. There's one small exclusion to that, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. So coming back around to our vertically integrated utilities, we do have three types of utility business models in place in the nation and in Georgia. The investor-owned or private utility, privately held entity like Georgia Power, your electric municipal cooperatives or EMCs, which are publicly owned by the member customers, and then your municipal utilities, which are also public utilities owned and operated by the municipal government. There are a variety of regulatory or oversight entities that play into the various elements of the value chain listed here at right. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I will highlight for you that we'll be talking about these three business models in a little more depth here later. And we'll talk about the decision makers and the influencers in each of those business models. One of them, certainly for our investor-owned, vertically integrated monopoly utilities, are the public service commissions or the public utility commissions. In the case, again, of Georgia, that's a public service commission that we have that does regulate Georgia Power. One of the other things I want to touch on then here is something that's important to understand about the energy and electricity landscape here in Georgia, which is what happened when PURPA came into force in 1978. So that's the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act. It was an element of the National Energy Act that was passed in response to the 1970s kind of gas and oil crisis under the Jimmy Carter administration. A number of policies were put forward to enhance the country's energy independence, to open up new pathways to clean and diversified power sources and move us away from our dependency on foreign oil and petroleum, really. But it spawned a variety of things that opened the door for demand side management and supply side reduction as we know it today, and various pieces of legislation, one of which we're talking about here, which is PURPA. The key thing for us to bear in mind about PURPA is it created the opportunity for competitive generation, I would almost call it that. It created the opportunity for independent power producers, or IPPs, to come into play. So other entities to move into the generation side of the equation and sell their power on the wholesale market to utilities. So these independent power producers can sell their power to an investor-owned utility, a cooperative, or a muni. It also created the opportunity for any interconnected generating unit to sell on the spot market. What that really means is that anybody who has combined heat and power or some other power source on site can also, that's an IPP, power on site. However, the generating unit side of the equation, apologies, is if I have a generating unit as a power company, then I can sell any excess power onto the spot market. So it created this opportunity for more dynamic wholesale power generation and purchase between these players, which again attempted to foster an environment where reductions on foreign dependencies for electricity generation and certain fuel types could thrive. What we've seen from that, to make it a little more real, is that what we've seen under PURPA is that we do have independent power producers, a handful of them in the state of Georgia, that are basically mini power plants. They are small wholesale generators, and they generate power that they sell onto the grid that is then consumed by the customers of Georgia Power, the EMCs, and or the munis, depending on how that transaction is playing out. What we might be able to talk a little bit about today is that those independent power producers here in Georgia are few and far between at the moment. And there's a variety of policy and other reasons why that's the case. So let's talk a little bit about deregulated and restructured markets now. So we talked about the vertically integrated utility, a regulated marketplace, and some of the elements that come into play there. In our deregulated or restructured markets, market participants can own power plants and transmission lines, but that value chain that we talked about is kind of split apart. So you end up with all generation is isolated, if you will, and generated electricity is sold into that wholesale market. The retail energy suppliers at the bottom of that vertical stack that we were looking at before purchase that electricity to sell it to their customers. And then the grid, the interconnection or the wires that move the energy from the generator to the endpoint consumer or the end use consumer is managed differently. And we'll talk a little bit more about this here in a moment as well. That is managed by, as highlighted here on this slide, an independent system operator, an ISO, or a regional transmission organization known as an RTO. When we think about the history lesson that Matt gave and the genesis of monopoly providers, there was a lot of chaos, as you can imagine, when the energy system was starting up. Everybody trying to figure out how to get a connection to this, that, or the other generator, how to make it work. And there was a lot of instability. And that monopoly and kind of territory-driven construct was there to stabilize and secure reliable delivery of this vital service of electricity and of energy. When you break that vertical chain apart that we talked about, and you take generation through to retail sales out of single control, and you say, okay, you can own power plants, you can serve the customer, you can do this, you can do that, you recreate a certain level of chaos. I like to think of it as productive chaos, however, for a variety of market and other reasons. But you need the wires in the middle to be organized and not as chaotic. And so the transmission and distribution systems get managed, well, really the transmission system gets managed by this RTO or ISO entity, which assures that all of the wholesale generators feeding onto the grid and all of the load, all of the demand and the consumption on the other side of the grid is balanced and being managed, that we're not over or under generating. And that is a very important role that they play. And we'll talk again a little bit more about those and the national landscape there in a moment. So in this restructured market, again, you break that vertical value chain or continuum apart, and you create opportunity for these RTOs or ISOs. You see this here in green, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Midwest Independent System Operator or MISO to operate in that traffic cop role between generation and transmission planning and then delivery to satisfy or supply the load. You then have transmission companies and local utilities that own those wires. You have some coordination services provided by the RTO and the ISO, and you have that distribution retail sales piece on its own, separate again from that top line generation. An analogy I'll give you very quickly is with natural gas. All of those postcards, here in Georgia, natural gas, remember, is a restructured market. So all of those postcards that you get from SCANA, Walton, GNG, all of these players, they are the purple box at the bottom. They are just a natural gas utility or marketer. So they are there to own that last mile, that last connection on the pipe and help maintain and manage that and manage the meter, not even really in some cases, and just to deal with the customer service and the retail sales. They have no hand in natural gas supply or the longer piece of pipe that's getting the gas from the supply point to your home or to your business. So with here, I'll hand it over to Matt to talk a little bit about that restructuring landscape nationally. We know in Georgia, remember, electricity is regulated, unrestructured. Gas is deregulated or restructured. And this is a little bit more about where the country sits.
Yeah, so this is an easier way to look at this than the maps that we'll show on the next couple of slides, where it gets very specific into the particular territories. But a lot of this work across the country when restructuring was really getting underway happened with initial legislation at the state level. And so you see certain states that went with both, deregulating both gas and electricity markets, and then some that only did one. So you've got more examples of states that just did gas than ones who just did electric. but you do have some examples on either side of that. So obviously like Texas and Oregon here are examples of just deregulated electricity, but not deregulated gas markets. Georgia would be probably our most important version of gas only on that side. But you can see states through the Midwest and the Northeast in particular that took both actions. The other notable thing here is just where you have some of these gaps. So you've got some of these, the Rocky Mountain or like the desert states out west, where neither has been deregulated. Some in the plains states, and then of course, a good handful of the Southeast. On the next slide, yeah, here we are. So this is the more detailed version of how this looks for electricity. So the power grid itself is not neatly carved up into statewide territories or at the state level. And so you have these variations of where power flows and how they're being organized. So these are showing the different ISOs and the RTOs that Lisa had mentioned before. So these are the, what territory do the deregulated market organizers oversee? And you can see there's a range that goes into Canada with some of these as well. MISO is probably the most relevant example for the US that also has a Canadian footprint. That's the light green that's running right through Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa, but it also connects down into the Southeast. So it rolls into Missouri and Illinois, and then it goes into Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. One little corner of Texas that happens to also be, right around Houston. That's all organized by that one same organization. The other one that plays a role in the South is PJM, which is the largest one in the country in terms of the total amount of energy that it manages on a day-to-day basis. And you can see that they are in the Mid-Atlantic and the Midwest states, plus Chicago. They have this like gap that goes west to Ohio and then jumps springboards over to Chicago. But they also have a segment, all of Virginia, and then one little corner in North Carolina, although there are some participants who have opted in with PJM in South Carolina, including one of their larger co-ops. I think with that we can, yep, wonderful. In Georgia, we have one investor-owned utility, that's Georgia Power. So that's that very large, fully integrated structure that we were mentioning before. We used to have two until Savannah Electric merged with Georgia Power in 2006, although they were organized in a very similar fashion, both of being Southern Company utilities. And they serve predominantly the largest cities. The largest load points across Georgia are served by Georgia Power. The electric membership co-ops, we call the EMCs, there's 41 of those, most of whom participate in wholesale markets, so the actual buying of electricity from power plants through Oglethorpe Power. So they own some generation as Oglethorpe, and they buy a lot of generation as Oglethorpe. Then you have three other EMCs that instead of keeping it all in Georgia necessarily, they're also buying wholesale from TVA, from Tennessee Valley Authority, which has one little tiny sliver of northern Georgia that's in their territory up around Chattanooga. And then the last one here are the munis. So these are standalone municipalities and smaller cities that have retained their own utility services. And so you have 51 of these plus one county. Similar to the way that the EMCs collectively come together with Oglethorpe, the municipals come together as MEAG, the Municipal Electric Authority of Georgia. except for a couple of them here. So there's just the last exceptions here at the bottom of the slide. If we were looking for how those break out in terms of retail sales, so who's serving what portion of the total electricity demand in Georgia, you can see the majority of that is served by Georgia Power. So that's 61% of it. Your co-ops, your EMCs are serving 30%, and then your municipal utilities are there at 9%. So for us, the way that the regulation goes forward is taking a look. For the IOUs, they are fully regulated by the Georgia Public Service Commission. So Georgia Power, everything is going through the Public Service Commission. So when they want to do a change in rates or they want to build a new power plant, they have to take it forward for approval to the commission. What's relevant there about their structure is that they're fully private. So they are working to try to ensure the best return for their shareholders at the end of the day. The electric membership cooperatives have less engagement with the Public Service Commission. So if there's a dispute over territorial lines or transfers, say like one customer wants to switch who their utility is, there can be debates that need settling by the Public Service Commission. That's going to happen. But for the most part, their decisions are overseen by an elected board of directors, which is specific to each of the co-ops. And then lastly, the munis, the role of the Public Service Commission is also generally just an oversight function for them. But instead of having a board of directors that oversees its activities, you have city council. So whoever the elected leadership is for that entire government also have utilities responsibilities. To make this seem as complicated as it is, we put this map here on the right, which is showing you where those different service territories are, so who gets to serve what portion of the state. And as should become apparent there, these are not necessarily nice, tidy boundaries at the county level or anything like that for Georgia. It's kind of a mess. But overall, this has been put in place to keep that retail competition basically at zero. You know, if you're in a specific territory, you are being served by a specific utility, and that has been detailed and codified in this law, in the Territorial Act of 1973, which was really the purpose of the law, to go ahead and lay down, these are the people who are going to be allowed to serve which customers in what parts of the state. There's one exception to what you would normally think of here. So like as a residential customer, we don't get to choose. You live in this particular area, this is your utility, hope it works for you. With the largest consumers, so very large commercial customers, and predominantly this was industrials and still is, you do get a one-time choice. So the law allows you one time to see if certain utilities want to compete for your energy business, they can. Since it is only a one-time affair, these are not the most common things to see happen, but they do happen from time to time. And those can, again, go through that oversight process from the Public Service Commission in order to make decisions related to those efforts. There was one recent example of that with it's fine, where we had Georgia Power and one of the EMCs were competing for the electricity business of one company that came in to create a new manufacturing line of business, and so they ended up The commission did get involved, but the EMC ended up winning that dispute. Now I'm good. The last thing here is just some other legislation that's been important in crafting the landscape in Georgia. So you have the Georgia Cogen and Distributed Generation Act of 2001. This set the rules for how large industrials that wanted to put cogeneration, which is combined heat and power, it's a way to get both useful heat and electricity delivered on site, and for homeowners or business owners that were interested in putting their own generation at their facilities, how those could go forward. So that it granted the ability to connect to the grid, but it also set some thresholds. So there were limitations to the total amount of distributed generation that a utility had to allow onto their system, which is set at kind of a really geeky threshold, but it's 0.2% of whatever the prior system's peak demand was. So whatever the maximum total amount of demand was that the utility served in the prior year, 0.2% of that can be up to that. They have to allow to connect to the grid as distributed generation. The utilities are allowed to make a choice to allow it to go beyond that, but they at a minimum have to allow up to that 0.2% level. The other two here, we've got the Georgia Nuclear Energy Financing Act of 2009. That allowed Georgia Power to begin to bill customers for the nuclear plants Vogtle units 3 and 4, so the two new nuclear installations that are happening in the state before those plants were done with construction, before those units were fully built and delivering electricity. The argument there was that it would be ultimately lower cost to customers to do it this way. So there's been a rider, if you are a Georgia Power customer, then you've looked closely at your bill, you've probably seen the NCCR line item on that, which is the Nuclear Construction Cost Recovery. And so that you're paying for it and have been for several years. And then the last one that's of note is the Solar Power Free Market Financing Act of 2015. It was viewed officially as a clarification of rules in Georgia to make it known that third parties could finance solar to go on other people's properties. And so throughout the country, this is normally called a power purchase agreement. In Georgia, that is now referred to as a solar energy procurement agreement. But it allows for a third party to put solar onto your roof, for example, and for you to pay a certain cent per kilowatt hour that you've arranged with that third party developer to meet some of your on-site energy needs.
Thanks, Matt. So that's a great rundown of more specifics on the industry and the electricity and energy system here in Georgia. We're going to take you really quickly through some of the key decision makers. I think this is really where the rubber meets the road. And I'm recognizing from a time check perspective that we are eating a little bit into our remaining time for discussion and Q&A. So I'm going to try to move us through this pretty quickly. Key decision makers we've alluded to in the discussions so far include our Public Service Commission. They are 5 commissioners elected statewide, but they must live in the district they represent. The one thing I'll flag for you here that you may have noticed is that 2 of them were on the ballot yesterday. So we'll move to that here shortly. But they do regulate Georgia Power, and they do provide oversight over the EMCs and the muni utilities around certain matters. And Matt has discussed some of that in terms of territorial disputes and otherwise. They also preside over key proceedings that Georgia Power is required to undertake. We'll talk a little bit about those here now. One of them being the Integrated Resource Plan. So Integrated Resource Planning, or the IRP that you may have heard about, is an every 3-year process. It's a significant proceeding. It is also usually accompanied by a rate case. Both of those proceedings, again, happen every 3 years. The most recent IRP and rate case were last year, in 2019. And the reason why I want to highlight the Integrated Resource Plan in particular is that it is a 20-year plan that the utility needs to file that is a look ahead at what it intends to do with regard to demand-side management or energy efficiency programs, as well as generation asset or supply-side decisions. That could be generation retirements, retirements of coal plants or otherwise. That can also be construction of new plants, such as Plant Vogtle Units 3 and 4, or construction of new utility scale solar or utility scale and other solar program offerings, where they are offering subscriber opportunities for commercial and industrial customers or for residential customers in the case of the community solar program they currently operate, and where they are offering opportunities for customer-sited distributed generation, et cetera. So it's a significant proceeding that everything you see on this slide and a bit more is contemplated during that proceeding. It takes 3 years, again, or I should say, I guess maybe 2.5 years for the utility to develop and file their plan, and then the proceeding itself effectively litigates that proceeding over the course of 6 months. The Public Service Commission is a quasi-judicial body, and so these proceedings are generally litigated proceedings with a variety of interested parties engaging. There is a lot of opportunity for interested energy customers and energy buyers of all shapes and sizes, from the individual residential homeowner through to the largest industrial interest and through to our cities and counties and municipalities, to engage in the IRP process in a variety of different ways, to work with the company in the run-up to the filing, as well as work with all parties during the proceeding itself, to ask for what they need, what they want, what they would like to see in the programs that Georgia Power is putting forth and in the generation assets that they are investing in. So I'll highlight again that the next proceeding, the next IRP, is on the horizon in 2022. In 2019, there were some good things that transpired. I'll just, to make it a little more tangible for you, give one example to say that as part of the 2019 IRP and rate case, there was a shift in the cap on monthly, well, I'll say there was a shift in the reimbursement for rooftop solar or self-generated solar customers. So individuals that have a rooftop solar system prior to that shift were not getting paid the same amount for the electrons they were pushing into the grid as they were for the electrons they were consuming from the grid. They were getting paid a different and lower export price than the price they were paying for grid-tied electrons. With that monthly netting discussion and debate and evolution through the proceedings in 2019, rooftop customers up to a limit are now going to be compensated evenly. So it's fair monthly billing or monthly netting, such that basically the price of one electron from the grid that I pay to the company is the same price that the company will pay me for one electron exported to the grid. So that was a small but important move forward that resulted from these IRP and rate case proceedings, an important place to have influence and have impact. The other thing I'll say, when you remember the pie chart that Matt spoke to, is when the investor-owned utility serves the percentage of retail customers and the retail sales, when it has the footprint that it does, shifts in these proceedings, shifts that the company puts forward in its filings, and shifts that the regulators approve through these proceedings are very, very impactful when it comes to statewide shifts in our energy infrastructure and energy systems. So these are our public service commissioners. There are 5 of them. As I mentioned before, 2 of them were on the ballot last night. This is a snapshot of the election results as of 9 a.m. this morning. I was not able to check back in prior to this afternoon, so I imagine that Commissioners Shaw and McDonald have officially won their seats, but I don't have the final numbers on that. The one thing I'll highlight for everyone's awareness, which is a little known fact here in Georgia, is that if a commissioner should step down before their term is up, and they do serve a 6-year term, their replacement is appointed by the governor. And when they are appointed, they can then appear on the ballot as the incumbent. I flag that because for a lot of voters, this is a very obscure office. They don't understand maybe what the Public Service Commission does or what level of impact and authority it has when it comes to making important energy decisions. And I think, as many of us know, deep down in the ballot, you see an incumbent, you don't really know what the office is or maybe who the challenger is. You might just be convinced that maybe voting for the incumbent makes sense. So this appointment cycle also provides an incumbent advantage to new arrivals. Both Commissioner Pridemore and Commissioner Shaw are appointments that by the governor to replace retiring commissioners. Commissioner Pridemore did win her seat back last year, and Commissioner Shaw, it appears, will have won his seat going forward as a result of yesterday's election. EMCs, I want to touch briefly on the decision makers at the EMC level. Matt spoke about the fact that they are governed by a member customer or a member owner, I should say, elected board of directors. There are 3 EMCs that serve Athens-Clarke County. You all may know of them, Jackson, Rail, and Walton. Each of them has 9 elected directors on their board, and each of those directors serves for a 3-year term. I just want to highlight here what's interesting is that Alton Thornton, who's the Clarke County representative on the Jackson board, was recently reelected uncontested. I say that because member owners can hold these board members accountable, and they do have their voice when it comes to voting for these board members. But a lot of these board elections are uncontested, and a lot of these elections, member owners must appear or deliver a ballot in person. There are no mail-in or remote options. So there have been some challenges around whether or not this is a truly representative opportunity for those member owners to influence what they want to see from their utility. But I just flag here that there are these directors, and the directors I've highlighted are those who are responsible for the relevant service territory in Athens-Clarke County. So with that, I'll push it over to Matt to bring it home for us with regard to some of the other decision makers that sit in the city county and the key players that we have to work with as we move forward.
So these are a few just details on who the suppliers are of these utilities within Athens-Clarke County. So the map is showing you, like I mentioned, the territorial maps can be difficult and messy, and they don't conform to other geographic boundaries that we might be familiar with. So this is an example of that. The yellow territory on this map is Jackson EMC. Georgia Power is the reddish territory. The beige is Walton EMC, and the purple that you kind of see in just a couple little corners there are Rail. So those are all the different suppliers for electricity for Athens-Clarke County. Natural gas, AGL, Atlanta Gas Light, is the one who's maintaining most of the system. But you have the 17 gas marketers who are interested in your business. And then on the water side, you have Athens Public Utilities delivering water service. The next slide has some additional opportunities. So it's not entirely, most of our presentation and discussion here is about supply, but it's not 100% about that. And so the supply is responsive to demand. So there are a number of opportunities to change what that demand profile looks like, and also to add some of our own supply locally. So these are just some of the types of policies and programs that might be considered for adoption, scored here based on their feasibility and their impact. So the taller, very dark green ones are anticipated to be very impactful and doable, and then less so the lighter the green or the shorter the bar. But many of these are financing options or also like new programs that the local government may undertake to try to influence the overall demand picture or some of the distributed generation supply part. And then the last slide we have here is just to say is we're trying to get towards 100% clean energy goal. Every place has got their own special context. And so some cities are going to have an easier time getting at this than others. And so I've got two examples here. The one on the right is probably the easier one to start with. It was work we did with Orlando and gaming out how they could get to 100% clean energy. And the main takeaway, if you can't read what's on the graphic, is that the dark gray color is the dirty energy component of their power supply, and you can see that shrinking over time and eventually getting to a stage where they are 100% clean, predominantly through energy efficiency and solar in their case. When we take a look at what's the state of play with Athens and how much they can get to by 2035, our maxed out case for the modeling results in what you see on the left side there. So 46% is directly within the control of the local government, mostly through energy efficiency activities. You can see that's 40% of the 46 of what might be developed. There's another portion that's going to come from Georgia Power, either directly or indirectly through the EMCs buying energy that Georgia Power generates as well. But there's another 14% that Georgia Power has planned to do. But that means that there's this remaining gap of about 39% if we just go forward with what the current utility plans are.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you, everyone. That's the end of our discussion portion, I guess, or I should say presentation portion today. I think the key things that we want to make sure that you all leave with are the energy system and the energy landscape is complex nationwide, here in Georgia, and certainly within Athens-Clarke County. But there are a lot of players, many of the partners that the city county needs to move forward towards the 100% goal, and others who have the clean energy transition squarely in mind and are approaching it in a variety of different ways. So there are opportunities to work through and with the electric utilities and the natural gas provider to undertake this journey. And the city county has a lot under its own control. You all have a lot in your own hands for some of the opportunities that Matt just highlighted here at the end. So, there are some challenges and barriers on the road ahead, but there's equal, if not more, opportunity. And there are a lot of players who are looking at these same challenges and opportunities alongside us. So we hope perhaps you've picked up a few new insights from this today. We welcome discussion, questions, answers now and going forward. And we're mindful of everyone's time. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mike and we'll take it from here. Thanks very much.
Great presentation. Thank you, Lisa and Matt. Does anybody have questions for them while they're here on the phone with us or in the meeting with us?
I'll kick one off. Early in the presentation, we kind of reviewed, or y'all discussed, the consumer risk that happened when some of the energy markets were deregulated, specific to Enron and California's markets. And with that, we saw very tremendous damage to individuals and businesses and the economy. In your opinion, what kinds of risk exist as we look at an evolution of an energy market that extends to significant distributed generation? So more solar, more consumers actually generating electrons.
All right, well, I'll kick it off, Andrew. It's a great question. I think that there's a couple of different things at play. There are community level and what I would term equity or participatory risks. Even though the cost of solar is dropping rapidly, not every resident, not every business will be able to deploy a local system, a rooftop system, or an adjacent kind of customer sited behind the meter system. So there are risks that there will be folks left behind. And I raise that first because what that means then is that the cost burden of maintaining our centralized system has the risk of disproportionately shifting to those who remain grid tied. The energy system is not an inexpensive endeavor from the standpoint of generation, transmission, distribution, retail service. And if there's a smaller customer base financially supporting that endeavor, then that's a significant risk. The other piece is the risk that you started off with when you framed your question with regard to Enron and California and some of the very real and perceived damage that was caused from those experiences. I don't think we've completely figured it out yet in terms of decentralizing the energy system, but I do think that we have found a lot more benefits than cost in moving in that direction. And I do think that our regional transmission organizations and our independent system operators and our RTOs and our ISOs have played and continue to play a key role in mitigating that risk. There have been a lot of lessons learned by those entities over time with regard to other blackouts and other power failures, and just looking at resilience of the energy system. We've got great examples in New England, for example, of a mass blackout where there was energy resilience in key parts of the community because of distributed energy. So there was a failure in that grid management space that was a huge lesson learned, but there were also some success stories that came out of that because distributed energy systems came to the forefront as, if you will, bright lights in a temporary sea of darkness. I don't know, Matt, what would you add to that?
I think those are good examples. I think we're continuing to see innovation in the competitive markets as well around, they're not all jumping immediately from 0 to 100, but you certainly see things from the federal bodies in particular that regulate those, the ISOs and the RTOs, so FERC, in that case, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has been issuing rules for the better part of the last decade, plus that have slowly made it more and more easy for distributed generation to meet the same kind of and play similar roles to what utility generation has done historically. So being able to provide capacity or energy and to do so in the areas where it's needed has been an increasing feature that we've seen, which is recognizing benefits that were already played. These are things that were already being provided by the distributed resources, but now they're able to be paid for what they've been providing. And that's going to help create better market signals at the same time that you still have the overall reliability function, which ultimately is a responsibility of the ISO and the RTO themselves.
Thank you. So in summary, what I heard is there is a systemic risk to low income and non-participatory users if the existing grid burden is fully shifted to them. And then I would also offer that there's probably also a consumer level risk if you have unethical players in the game. So if I come in and offer you, maybe through the solar energy procurement law, an incorrect analysis on your savings and you've entered a legal commitment for that procurement, I financially harmed you. You could argue a free market will resolve that relatively quickly, which is, so maybe it's not as significant as systemic level risk.
Yeah, Andrew, the one thing I would flag that Matt knows I'm passionate about, and I think he is as well, that with regard to someone modeling a system incorrectly for you and you entering into a long-term arrangement perhaps that is not suitable for your load, is the lack of data access. So in order for third-party providers to shape and size and sell or propose to you an accurate system for your household needs or the needs of your business, they're doing a lot of modeling and extrapolation off of the utility data available to them today. A greater level of granular utility data access would help to provide for more accurate quotes and project proposals from service providers that would hopefully help to mitigate some of that risk of consumers entering into a poor purchase, if you will. Another advancement we're seeing on that front is some of the inclusive financing that's coming out for energy efficiency, as this group knows, with the Pay As You Save pilot that will be serving up to 250 homes in Athens-Clarke County. There are governors, if you will, within the way that modeling works and very site-specific or household-specific energy modeling that takes place to mitigate any risk of those energy efficiency upgrades failing to deliver, if you will, net savings right out of the gates.
Sweet, thank you.
All right, any other questions? This is a great time to ask if you have them.
Yeah, I had a question. So on the list of things that were feasible for the community and also things that were effective for the community was solar co-op. That kind of hit both of them relatively at a high level. Can you describe what that is and how is that different than community solar? What would that look like in Athens? How is that set up? How is that structured?
So yeah, I mean, it's going to vary depending on the part of the country that you're in and what sort of regulations you have governing it. So in Athens, there's one obviously legal way to go about it, which would be like community solar that's being administered by one of the utilities that the community has bought into. There are other interesting ways that I think still may face legal challenges of trying to set up, having a third-party developer create a solar installation, so not the utility, but having somebody else build solar with the intent of serving the need of the community, but selling the power ultimately back to one of the utilities or to the transmission network, which is traditionally called a virtual power purchase agreement. There are lawyers on both sides that would say that that's legal or that's not legal in Georgia. So there's still some stuff to be ironed out about the approach on that front.
This would be a good time for me to just highlight that there were some slides we didn't get to, which were more appendix that have a little bit of a glossary of terms, because there's a very important distinction in Georgia between community solar and cooperative solar. And the way those programs are set up. So some of that is terminology and branding, and some of that is specifics of program design. So the EMCs deploy subscription-based solar programs that they brand or call cooperative solar. They are cooperatives, and so that makes a lot of sense. But what they've really done is they've built a utility scale solar array, and they are selling a subscription to a share or a portion of the solar electrons generated by that utility scale solar array somewhere in the state, not necessarily near where you live, likely in their service territory, but somewhere else. Similarly, Georgia Power's program is set up the same exact way, but they call it community solar, and that's fine as well. Again, solar arrays in different corners of the state, providing a subscription opportunity for you to purchase some of the solar electron production, solar energy production from those arrays. What Matt was alluding to is that what some people will say is that true community solar provides an opportunity for ownership. I am not paying for a share of the electrons off of a solar array owned by the EMC or owned by Georgia Power. I actually have purchased X number of panels in that solar array that is somewhere in my local community. And Matt owns another X number of panels, and Andrew owns, Y number of panels, and we all have an ownership stake in this solar development. The reason why some will say that air quotes, true community solar is not possible here in Georgia is because of the Territorial Service Act. And I would be infringing on Georgia Power's service territory if I were to build a small scale, utility scale array in my yard and sell portions of it, ownership and portions of it to my neighbors. I've effectively violated the Territorial Service Act if I've done that. So that's where there's some, a mix of terms around cooperative solar, community solar, both marketing and branding terms, but also very project or design specific terms in terms of what the solar development really is and how its physical panels and the panel production is sold to the various off-takers or subscribers. Great
Thank
question,
you.
though, because it does generate a lot of confusion.
So in terms of those programs that Georgia Power has and that the EMCs have, they don't seem to be very financially beneficial to customers. Like, you seem to pay a premium for your electricity by going that route.
To differing degrees, yes, depending on how it's priced. And I think in some cases, the utilities are fairly transparent about the fact that it is not a program that delivers bill savings, that it is a premium program, or that it is a green energy program, that if you value green and clean energy, they would love for you to support that by subscribing. Others remain a little more silent on the true value proposition, if you will, when it comes to the impact on your bills. There are examples, however, elsewhere in the country of programs that do deliver, I think, intentionally deliver more bill benefit. And so we've seen examples of those elsewhere, and we're hopeful that they'll serve as good templates or good examples of what might be able to be deployed here in Georgia in the future.
Great questions.
Just wanted to say you don't have to go far. I mean, there's 2 examples in Florida from Duke, Florida, and Florida Power and Light right now that do provide that bill savings opportunity through participating in their solar programs.
Yeah. And I think that's another, without going too far down this rabbit hole, that's an interesting place where not only policy can help to make that happen, but unique partnerships can help to make that happen. There are examples where one of the ownership stakes, for example, or significant ownership stakes in a community solar array belong to commercial and industrial customers. Some people call it kind of an anchor tenant model. And then a much smaller slice is made available for residential subscription. And those commercial industrial customers or anchor tenants help to kind of rationalize that price point across all the participants in a way that reduces that premium you see in some programs that we see today. Just one way to crack that nut. So there are a lot of different ways to approach it.
Okay, anybody else? If you think of something, feel free to email and we'll try to get you an answer. A quick reminder that the next CAB meeting is on Wednesday, November 18th from 2 to 4. In addition to the regular agenda, we will also have another one of these educational components, and it will focus on energy burden and housing inequity. So that will be coming up on November 18th. Thank you for joining us today, and we appreciate the input and the great questions. So if there's nothing else, we will be signing off. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.